Hi, good morning. I am Carissa Trenton, Communications and Fund Development with Family Service Regina. Today I am joined by Glenda Myles. Glenda is a psychotherapist who has additional training in grief, bereavement, end-of-life care, and trauma. She's worked as a counselor and workplace wellness coordinator with Family Service Regina for 2.5 years. Good morning, Glenda.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. So can you explain a little bit about what grief is?
So I think we often confuse grief and bereavement. So I'm going to kind of separate this. Grief is our internal response to loss of all kinds. And it is complex in terms of the emotions. So there's often sadness, but there might be anger and hurt, and even just this longing often as we move through loss or the endings of things. So, we've all been in relationships, for instance, or maybe we all have been in relationships that have come to an end. And even when we may have been the one ending the relationship, there's still this kind of sense of loss or sadness that is grief, really, and when things come to an end. Often we do this when we're transitioning through life, like coming to the end of school. There's this sense of happiness, right, about the new beginning, but there's still this sense of sadness or grief at what we're losing, the connections with our friends, perhaps, or just the routine of school, the safety often for some people. And so bereavement is a specific kind of grief and loss related to the death of a loved one. And so that is obviously different. And often it's not just a loved one, a human, but often people, are bereaved when they have a loss of a pet, or even sometimes we're seeing this more and more celebrity figures or sports figures that really are really important figures in people's lives. I mean, most notably, maybe in the last year or so was Kobe Bryant and the death of him and his daughter. And really, the tragic loss was felt and bereaved by lots of people around the world in relationship to that. So bereavement isn't necessarily just people who are close to us, although that's obviously true.
That's a really good way to kind of separate the two, because I think a lot of the times you're right, those lines are kind of blurred and people do think of grief as being the same as bereavement. So what maybe are some signs and symptoms that kind of differentiate both? I think you kind of touched a little bit on it, but let's maybe take a little bit of a step back and lay it out a little bit.
Yeah. So maybe I'll speak specifically to bereavement in particular, and maybe I'll do a little bit of a history lesson. Lots of people have probably heard about the stages of grief, if you will, which kind of dates back to this beautiful work that was done by Dr. Kubler-Ross, dating back actually to 1969. So some time ago, even before I was born, and I'm old.
Come on now, no, you're not.
So Dr. Kubler-Ross actually was working with people who were dying. And she started to notice that there was some things that were similar around people who were dying. And so she developed, and then certainly was joined by David Kessler and their work on the stages of grief. And it's still probably the most well-known, right? Acceptance, denial, anger, all of these things that we go through. The unfortunate thing was that people kind of represented one thing, that these were actually came from people who were dying, not necessarily from those who were grieving the loss of those people.
Interesting.
Right? Because it's not the same thing. Somebody dying is going through a different journey than those people who are maybe watching the person dying. Now, there's certainly some similarities. The other thing is that people kind of got this idea that the stages meant it was linear, that I moved from this stage to this stage to this stage. The reality is, and like that, it's more like a mix, and some people feel certain elements more than others. But often, what we know is that we do move through this. And since David Kessler has added like a 6th stage, which is meaning, and adding meaning to it. And certainly that's an important component when we've moved through the loss of a significant person, is adding meaning, both to our life, but also to the relationship.
Mhm.
Probably not as familiar to most people is that there's a lot of other grief theories out there. In fact, I probably use a few other ones way more frequently in grief counseling than Dr. Kubler-Ross's work, which although is still significant, so not to diminish the work that they did. But there's a few, like one of my teachers, Dr. Kumar, who wrote a book called Mindful Grieving, that talks about mindfulness and actually being very aware of our feelings, right?
Mhm.
And what we're feeling, giving a little bit of, not a little bit, giving as much space to those emotions as we need as we move through, but not being overly identified with what that means. And certainly we have a whole bunch of emotions, anger, sadness, hurt, all of these things will come up and they're all okay, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes people will start to feel bad or have guilt or shame around certain emotions that they have, where we want to just give space to all of it's okay, right? It's all okay. Normal people feel this. One of the other kind of models of grief that I love is what we call a dual process model of grief. And I'll try and explain this as simply as possible.
I love it. Keep it coming.
The world moves on what I'm going to call linear time, right? We wake up at the same time, the clock ticks around, we have appointments at specific times. It's, and then we kind of go to bed and we wake up and we do it all over again. It's like Groundhog Day, especially during COVID, right? We've all had those feelings. So this is very much linear time. The world moves according to this linear time. And then there's this other sense of time. I often call it sacred time, but it's like the liminal space, this period of the in-between when we're transitioning, and grief is in this sacred space, in this liminal space between, that does not move in the same time as this linear time. And so often people will even describe to me as they're grieving of waking up in the morning and being angry that the sun has come up, because for them, they don't want time to move on because they want to be in that space where they were holding their loved one, as an example, right? And so what we try to do is make sense of those two spaces, and that when we grieve, we're really in this liminal space. We're in this sacred space. And then what we do is we move back into the linear space, and we learn to go back to work and to move through it. And then we go back into this other space, and there's really this movement between the two. And it's hard actually to transition. So it actually causes us pain. When we're in one of the spaces or the other, we're okay. We learn how to cope, but it's often when we move between the two where we add the feelings, the emotions to it. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense.
So I think it's also creating the space for people that this is normal, that it's okay to have all of those feelings about moving. It's like Einstein in the theory of relativity, right? Time, there's like a 6-second kiss that can feel like an eternity. And then there can be those moments of tragedy where, it feels the opposite. A life, when you start getting older, you realize it happened in a blink of an eye.
That's very true. Yeah. I swear I was 20 years old last week. I don't know what
Or that our children were. My daughter just had her 31st birthday. I'm like, oh my goodness, like, how did that happen? Right?
Right. My son is, becoming a preteen. And I'm like, no, you were 3, like last week. I swear. I totally get it. So what are some like COVID-19, maybe grief specific issues?
So we know that there's a couple of things. So related, I'm just going to talk about grief, and then I'll talk about bereavement and COVID, because that's been a real challenge for lots of people. But just at the grief level, which meaning our internal response to loss, we've all experienced this to a larger, a smaller degrees over the past year. So we're almost at a year of the pandemic, just a couple of weeks away from us recording.
Happy anniversary.
Yeah. And so during that time, we've moved through loss in lots of ways, working from home, right? That sense of community that we may have felt at the office, whether you liked it or not, whichever you prefer, it was still movement and a change. And that sense of loss of many things, of connecting to our families in the same way and to friends in the same way. Being able to get on a plane and go somewhere, like, the loss of many of us had to, cancel our trips and things like that. So there was a lot of sense of loss, even in terms of our own routines. Definitely also for those people who may have gotten laid off or lost their job, the work we do is often a sense of identity. And so that loss can be significant in our lives, right? Of like, who am I now if this is not the work that I do or that I can provide for my family or for myself in a meaningful way. And so often as that has, and even just the loss of the routine, again, that time and space that we move through, all of a sudden we're at home, life is different, it can bring up lots of feelings and emotions attached to it that people might not even recognize as what is called grief, right? It's like this really uneasiness or discomfort that people feel with change and transitions for things.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. And it feels uncomfortable because we live and we want to just avoid it. We want to numb out from it. We don't want to feel our feelings. Not everybody. And therefore, when we don't want to feel feelings, we go to unhealthy and healthy coping strategies, whatever those are for people. Unfortunately, with COVID, lots of our coping strategies or our healthy coping strategies aren't always available to us in this past year, right? Where gyms have shut down or we can't hang out with people that we used to, or our friends group, and social connection is so important. And, we're being asked to transition or do it in a different way, which some people, again, it's like, well, I don't want to, I want it the way I want it, right? So how people move through change, their own ability to adapt to change will impact how they move through the grief and be with the discomfort of the grief as well. Now, as it relates to bereavement in particular, this has been a really challenging one for anyone who has experienced both the dying of a loved one. So whether people are in long-term care facilities or the hospital, they've had limits as to who can go to those places. And so loved ones haven't been able to see people in the same way that we would normally go to the hospital and be with people as they're dying. And so that has been really hard for people. They haven't felt, I have lots of clients who just didn't feel like they got to say their goodbyes in the ways that they wanted to, because FaceTiming with someone who maybe even sedated, right, is not the same thing as holding their hand or hugging them or being with them or giving them a kiss and saying what you need to say. So we're finding ways of coping with it or new ways of doing it, but it's not quite the same. And then, of course, people who've died, whether we knew they were going to die or it was tragic or suicide rates are increasing and through the roof right now. So we add trauma, which I know we're going to talk about in another session. And then we add on the grief of the way we mourn or the rituals that we have for the death are really important and not to be underestimated. I think for a large part, people have recognized this past year. I mean, we have had 3 family members in our own family who've passed away this year. And it's been really hard, right? We haven't been able to have funerals. If you do, it's small gatherings. We're not allowed to kind of gather. People say, not even. And so like in every tradition around the world, we have traditions and rituals around how we mourn, which are the external, the things we do to mark the death of a loved one. And for many of those, they've had to be adapted or just removed altogether, which has been significant.
Yeah.
There's things that we do that seem inconsequential, but are actually really important things to mark how we move through grief or don't. And so grief is a normal thing. We all have to deal with bereavement. At some point, everyone we know will die.
Yeah.
That's just a reality, unfortunately, right?
Yeah.
And so we will all have to move through this, but how we do so is really important. And those markers and rituals are really important. So whether you are Irish like me and have a wake, or, you know, you're Jewish and you sit Shiva, or, you know, you're Indigenous and there's a whole process that they go through, right?
Yeah.
And so different traditions, all religious groups, even non-religious people still have these rituals through our culture and society that are really important, that have been taken away from us in some ways, or have had to be adapted, that aren't quite the same. And that's been a challenge for people.
Yeah. Do you maybe recommend any sort of coping strategies that are COVID-friendly coping strategies? I know we kind of talked about not being able to see your family, and, you know, you yourself and your family have suffered some loss, and I know my family has as well. We lost my Aunt Frida a couple months ago. So is there anything that you can recommend to somebody who might be experiencing bereavement and isn't able to access a gym and isn't able to be with their friends and isn't able to spend time with their extended family?
Yeah, I think one is that, as hard as this is going to sound, and it's not to diminish anyone's experience, it's accepting the fact that we are in this time and that those things aren't going to look the same as they used to.
Yeah.
We actually bring more suffering to ourselves because we want and expect something to be different than what it is, if that makes sense. So
Yes.
That's part of it, is going, okay, this isn't what I would wish. However, this is how it is. And so how do we create the best situation, right, for ourselves and our loved ones as possible? So although we want to be in the same room together, we can't, and so we Zoom it, right? Even us right now. You know, and I think we've all kind of gotten like, okay, it's not quite the same, and that's okay. As needed, I think we need to make choices for ourselves about the balance of risk and what our needs are. And so gathering maybe with some small groups of people as needed, I think is more important sometimes in a way to manage those risks, of course, because we do need human touch. We do need supports together. And it's okay to reach out to those people that maybe you do need. As people are moving through grief, if it does become from a sense of overwhelming, is to reach out for help as needed, right? If there's one thing I could leave everybody with, you know, not that we're finishing this up, but I'll probably say this more than once, it's recognizing that if you are someone who's supporting someone else who's moving through moving through bereavement, that grief, there is no timeline for this. Whatever you believe to be true is malarkey. Okay. And that was my
I love that. And it's so true. It's true. There is no timeline.
And remembering again about this linear time and this grieving time. So in past, many traditions or many peoples would wear black. So as an example, a widow would wear black for a year often, or, you know, we wear the black wristbands or armbands, or there's be some signifier to other people that this person is mourning, and we would pay respect to that person by not having the same expectations of them to be moving through linear time with us in the same way. Unfortunately, we don't do that as much anymore. And so what happens is we sometimes as humans forget that this person is moving through this really hard thing, And so we kind of go, oh, are you over that yet? Like people have actually said this to people, right? Which can be heartbreaking to that other person. It can create a sense of, I don't want to be a burden to people. I don't want to bring it up. I don't want to tell people that I'm still hurting, even though I'm still really hurting over this loss. And so remember that people can be hurting for a year, at least, right? And even longer after this. That if somebody has lost a child, for instance, that is not something that you just get over. You don't get over the loss of anyone, by the way. You move forward. You learn to integrate that loss into your life and into your space, and you move forward, right, in that linear time. But that doesn't mean that you don't feel that sense of loss still.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I think that it's good to kind of share that with people as well, because I think there is different expectations, and people might say, just like what you said, they do say, and that is very heartbreaking to hear somebody say, are you over that yet? So I appreciate that, and I think that that's really good information for the people who are watching. Now, what else do I have here? So the last thing I kind of have is, what would you say to someone who's watched this and is still feeling overwhelmed with grief? I know that, we do offer counseling services at Family Service Regina, but I also know that you have your own practice as well, which maybe you can talk a little bit about both.
Okay. So I guess there's a few things. One is, yes, we have counseling here. We have the walk-in clinic as well. I'm in private practice with and do grief counseling. Also, there's certain organizations in their community that offer grief support groups. Generally speaking, although there is some exceptions, most grief support groups are, when you had perhaps 6 months to a year after the death of someone. I'll tell you why. Because we're in groups, you need to have moved through enough of your own grief that you can hear and be with and hold space for other people's grief. And when we're in it at the beginning, there is no holding space for it. We can barely hold space for our own grief, let alone anybody else's. And so often, what we're experiencing now, or what I've noticed with lots of people right now, is there has been over this past year this cumulative effect of grief. So it isn't just one kind of grief. So it can become really overwhelming for people, because it's like, okay, I just can't handle one more thing. I just can't handle one more thing. And it's like, okay, then that may be when you want to reach out for some support and just walk through it in a different way. I mean, often with my grief clients, it's not the same as regular counseling. Sometimes it's just normalizing and working through some of those things. Sometimes it's just they want to have a space where they get to talk about what's going on without feeling that sense of burden, or that, well, I think my family or friends think I should be over this by now. And of course, I would never say that, right? I'm going to hold space to go, no, you shouldn't be. If you're not, you're never going to be over it, right? I mean, I'm sure people would find it odd, but in my house, we have ashes of multiple people and pictures in a space where we honor those people in our lives, both my family, like my parents and my partner's late wife, and people that are important to us. And it's, we need those spaces and honoring of those people who have been in our life and who are important to us. And that's important. If I guess maybe the second thing I'd leave is, somebody's listening to this and has a loved one or a friend who's gone through something this year in particular, the only thing you really have to do, or you can do to be support, is listen. If you say to them, how are you? Be open to the possibility of them saying, I'm really sad, and be okay with that. To ask them about their loved one, right? To talk about stories, because that is, as much as that may make them cry, it also brings them comfort often in the connecting with those people.
Yeah, I think that that's helpful too, because I think a lot of people don't know what to say in those moments, right? They don't know, should I bring it up? Is it something I can talk about? If there is kind of that opening question and that person is willing to talk. So I think that that's really helpful too.
Yeah, and you take your cues from them, because some
Yeah.
people, especially at work, if they're coming back to work, they may not want to talk about it because they're trying to be in that linear
Yeah.
space again. And so kind of take your cues from them as to what they want to do, and even ask them, and to prepare yourself that way.
Yeah.
But to kind of take your cues from them. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, Family Service Regina does offer a free walk-in counseling service. It is Monday through Friday. You can visit the website at familyserviceregina.com or give us a call at 306-757-6675. Sessions are approximately 1 hour long and, like I said, completely free of charge. So if you or someone you know is looking for some support, that's where you can head. You can also visit Glenda's website and her private practice. Glenda, if you want to give yourself a little plug here.
It's my name's Glenda Myles, MYLES, and it's mindfulhealingtherapy.com.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you so much for talking to us today, Glenda.
Thank you.
Okay, so I am just going to end the recording if I can get out of there. All this crap keeps popping up.